Good morning. I'm Ann Vale. I'm director of the School of Human Environmental Sciences at the University of Kentucky. And I want to welcome you all to our second Family Impact Seminar. We've had one previous Family Impact Seminar. The goal of the Family Impact Seminar is to look at policy issues that legislators are currently addressing from a family perspective. We oftentimes look at issues from an economic perspective, from a political perspective, from an environmental perspective, and we're trying to introduce the whole notion of looking at the issues from a perspective of how they impact individuals and families. Because the School of Human Environmental Sciences is located in the College of Agriculture, Food, and Environment, we also want to choose to look at things through an agricultural lens as well. So that is the reason for our topic today, looking at food policy councils, making decisions around agriculture that impact positively families, individuals, and consumers here in Kentucky. So last year we looked at how we can support agriculture in providing healthy, sustainable foods that will impact the health status of families across Kentucky. This year we wanted to look at one of the issues that came out of our work last year, and that was the whole notion that Kentucky needed to consider the implementation of food policy councils. And certainly we do have several of those across the state, but wanted to dig a little bit deeper with people who have more experience than we do and learn a little bit about what works, what can we learn from, and what might be best for implementation here in Kentucky. The whole arrangement of a Family Impact Seminar is to bring in experts from around the country to have them share with you their research, their on-the-ground learning and knowledge and experiences, and let policymakers dialogue with them about questions they might have. We're not here to influence policy. We're here to educate policymakers and then also people who would be charged with implementing policy. So I don't want to spend a lot of time telling you about our history, but just wanted to give you a little bit of background. I want to let our speakers have the majority of the program. So let me move to the program and tell you about our four experts we have visiting with us today. You should have received a booklet from when you checked in about food policy councils, and it's a little bit of the background of each one of our speakers, their perspectives related to their work, and some suggested resources. You should have also received a program that has each of our speakers' names listed there. What I would like to do is introduce all of our speakers at one time so that they can just keep going with the presentations. We will take questions after each speaker and then also at the end. And then those of you that are in the legislature are invited to join our speakers for lunch afterwards for a more personal dialogue about the issues. We are pleased to start this Family Impact Seminar about food policy councils with Dr. Gail Finstra, who is joining us from the University of California at Davis. She is Deputy Director of the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. We thought you might not make it due to 16 inches of snow in Chicago, so we're very glad that you are with us. She is going to present information about the importance of understanding local and regional food systems and how to identify and target improvements in our food systems across Kentucky. We also have Mr. Mark Winnie, who is joining us from New Mexico, where he lives, but he is a senior advisor of Johns Hopkins University Center for a Livable Future and will provide us with an overview of policy councils and his experience with them. We also have joining us Pam Roy, also from New Mexico, and she is the co-founder of the New Mexico Food and Agriculture Policy Council. So she will provide us with valuable information about the development of the State Food Council in New Mexico and some of the lessons learned through that development and its implementation. And finally, we will wrap up our whole morning with one of our own. We're pleased to have Dr. Janet Mullins from the University of Kentucky, Department of Dietetics and Human Nutrition. She's going to tie all of this together for us and place it in context of what is happening here in Kentucky and talk about how we might implement some of these ideas here. So without further ado, I thank you all for joining us at the Food Policy Council seminar, and I would like to introduce Dr. Fenster, who will start with her presentation. Welcome to Kentucky.
Thank you so much. Here we go here.
You're on the sides.
Oh, okay. I'm not seeing anything. I'm like, how are people seeing this? Well, it is really an honor for me to be here in Kentucky with you as you're considering the next part of strengthening your Kentucky food policy network. And I want to start by commending you on, or the Community Farm Alliance for that fabulous report that was done. I especially like the goal of building a grassroots democratic process for determining local food needs and sustainable solutions. And I really believe that creating that kind of a strong foundation is essential to getting closer to what we mean by a sustainable food system. So one of the strategies that more and more communities are using to move towards sustainable food systems is to engage our local, regional, and state policymakers, as you all are doing today. It's a delight to have you here. And one message that I want to leave you with is that opportunities really abound for supporting the food systems that we all want to see from farm to fork. And one of the keys, I believe, is investing in policy coordination. And I'm going to talk more about that. The form that it takes, of course, is up to you. But what I'm going to do today is give you a little bit of my experience from California, particularly how our Cooperative Extension Service at the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program has been contributing to helping to build local food policies in California. So for the next few minutes, I want to do three things. The first is describe the context of the food system within which food policy occurs. The second is to describe the food system assessments that we have done and how they've supported local food policies and food policy councils. I want to mention a couple of examples of food policies in our neck of the woods and some of the health and economic outcomes that have resulted from those food policies and others. And then I want to end with a few reflections about how policymakers can help create spaces for more resilient, equitable, and sustainable food systems. So let me start with what I mean by a food system. And this circular representation sort of includes all the components, the farm-to-fork components of a food system, from production, distribution, marketing, preparation, and consumption, and including the waste stream. The next ring of the circle represents the food system environment and the influences on the food system and the food supply chain. That includes things like the economy, labor, culture, and of course, ag and food policy. And then that outside ring represents large-scale global conditions that make the need for food system change so urgent: climate change, globalization, resource depletion, and wealth disparity. And that outer level of the circle represents some of the challenges that our food system faces and the local consequences: nutritional health, food security, farm worker and food system worker well-being. And those are the drivers for communities to get more engaged in their food systems like you all are doing, to understand how they're working and how they're faring and how policy can make a difference. So for the last 28 years or so, SARAP, the Sustainable Ag Program where I work, has been supporting sustainable food and ag systems in California. And we define sustainable food systems as economically viable, environmentally sound, and socially just and responsible. And at the center of this is the notion of health. Health for our land and ecosystems and our communities and our economies. So they all go together here. In order to get to that, I think we need to refocus attention, that's all of us, whether we're in education, research, or policy, on our food production systems, our food distribution and regional infrastructure for agriculture and food systems, for consumption patterns and equity, and food policies. So that's where we'll move next. To help communities learn more about what's going on in their food systems, what we've been doing in California is conducting food shed or food system assessments of our food systems on a county-wide basis. And by that I mean a comprehensive and systematic analysis of the food system from farm to fork. We look at data from the environment, the production sector, distribution, processing, consumption, food access, and the waste stream. And the hallmarks of these food system assessments are that they're county-wide, that we involve and engage diverse members of the community, that we gather data from farm to fork, so it's all in one place, and we look at how the sectors interact with each other in order to draw conclusions about what kind of gaps are there and where policy perhaps could be focusing its attention. So many of the communities I've worked with have identified 3 or 4 common values in their food system. And I'm going to give you a few examples now from San Diego, which is one of the most recent food system assessments we've done. So, for example, they came up with 3 main goals: better health and well-being for all their residents, stewardship of the environmental resource base, and thriving communities and sustainable economic growth. Things that everybody could agree on. So within those, and this is hard to read, so I'll just give you a couple of examples. Those 3 colored areas are those 3 goals I just discussed. So here's a couple of the sub-goals that they wanted. So in the first one, on better health and well-being, they said San Diego residents will know where their food comes from, how it grows. That was one of their goals. Under ag stewardship, they said San Diego will increase its working lands for urban and rural food production. And the third one, an example, is San Diego food system provides safe, fair, and meaningful work for its residents. And then for each of these goals, the next thing we do is we collaboratively select indicators and gather data to show us progress on how that county is progressing on each of those goals. So we do it over time. This is a tiny little graph about direct sales in the food system in San Diego County. And we look at it in comparison not only to itself, but to the state and to the U.S., or whatever other kind of comparisons they want to use. And we follow that up with qualitative information, interviews, focus groups, surveys, to really understand why those trends are the way they are. So it's not just a set of numbers. And then the other thing that we have found is that participatory process with all members of the community is really key. Now, this can be a great collaboration between our research institutions and our community organizations, and all of us have found the value of building that group identity, taking ownership of the food system as a result of this process, and having the opportunity to explore diversity both within that group and broader within the food system. One of the valuable things that has emerged, and I'm sure that you folks have participated in these kinds of things too, is visiting different parts of the food system together. We have found that these visits provide tangible stories, both for ourselves and for policymakers, about innovative parts of the food system. So, for example, as uncovering what was going on in San Diego, we visited the New Roots Community Farm, which was led by the International Rescue Committee there. And it's a 2.3-acre strip of city-owned land tended by local refugees from 3 different cultures, Somali Bantu, Hispanic, and Hmong. And they are growing, eating, and cooking traditional foods together and learning from each other about how to do that, how to deal with food insecurity. They're selling some of that product to local restaurants, and it is one of the best examples I've seen of working across differences in a food system. So it was a really inspiring place. Our food system assessments then conclude with a synthesis of what we learn across the food system from all the data we gather and all of the stories that we've been able to collect. And we include recommendations that show areas that are ripe for future exploration. And these reports are used to support the policy priorities that come out of these organizations. The San Diego Food System Assessment, for example, was used as one of the foundational documents when they were developing their San Diego Food System Alliance, which is like a food policy council. And as they developed their San Diego Action Plan, they had data to back up why they were doing what they were doing and where they wanted to go. So in other cities in California, and I know nationwide, we have actually 26 food policy councils in California with an overarching statewide food policy council, but many have been launched with the help of food system assessments. And food policy councils themselves are there for convening both citizens and government officials to create these comprehensive plans for a state or local food system, and to develop ag and food policies that affect how food is produced and processed, distributed, purchased. They influence then food programs, food businesses, individuals, and community health. So there's a lot of room here for influencing the food system. I just wanted to give you a few examples of what's going on in California so you could find out what's going on in our neck of the woods. It was a nice review for me to see what's going on locally. I think many people around the country heard about Berkeley becoming the first city to pass a soda tax. So Measure D imposes a 1 cent per ounce tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, and the idea behind it was because the citizens wanted to reduce exposure to sugary drinks that contribute to overweight and obesity, particularly for children. So that was one example. In Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Food Policy Council developed the Good Food Purchasing Pledge, which is not a policy exactly, it's a pledge to leverage the purchasing power of the city's largest institutions. And within a couple of months of the launch of the Good Food Purchasing Pledge, 4 city departments and 2 private organizations committed to the pledge and enabled good food, as they're defining according to those 4 goals there, to be part of more than 750,000 meals across the city. There's other kinds of policies, like in land use. California's Strategic Growth Council just recently unanimously approved the Sustainable Agriculture Land Conservation Program, which provides funding for conservation easements that permanently protect the state's farm and ranch lands, especially around cities. And this program will be funded this year with a $5 million from our cap and trade revenue. Another is the California AB 551, which is our Urban Ag Incentive Zones Act. And the city governments can designate certain areas as urban ag incentive zones. And therefore, landowners who commit their land to ag uses for at least 5 years would get a reduction in their property taxes, which then encourages more urban agriculture. Farmers markets. AB 1871 will provide, this is recently passed too, will provide farmers market funding to enforce rules at farmers markets so that managers can be assured that the food is coming from the farmers and they're growing it themselves. Another one, in the area of food security, at least 10 states have enacted legislation, probably more, and I'm sure that our next speakers will speak about this more, but supporting the use of electronic benefit transfer machines at farmers markets. Or other states provide funds that double or add to food stamp SNAP benefits at farmers markets. And I just wanted to mention that I know that Kentucky has already been involved in food policies, creating Kentucky Proud, and we just saw down in the cafeteria downstairs the sign for Kentucky Proud. So I'm really delighted to see that. Creating a legislative task force on childhood obesity and tax credits for farmers for edible ag products donated to food banks. Those are all examples that you're already doing. And they're all wonderful policies. I think what a statewide food policy council could do is to provide coordination, oversight, ongoing analysis, and collaboration to make sure that all parts of the food system are attended to and are coordinated. So the next question is, okay, so what? Do these policies make a difference? I would say, in a short answer, yes. And I just want to give you a couple of examples from my own experience. When we were doing the San Diego food system assessment, we found a significant decrease in the consumption of sugary drinks in children, and I was kind of surprised by that. I couldn't figure out why, and we found out it had to do with a soda ban, first locally and then statewide in the schools, so that children didn't have access to soda on campus. In 3 Northern California school districts, which I work in, I work a lot in farm-to-school programs in California, they had all made a commitment to local procurement policies in the school food purchasing, and we saw local procurement go up in each of those school districts. We also saw produce consumption go up because of that, and especially in fruit. And this is Winters, which buys 80% of their produce from regional farmers. And we saw sales to regional farms go up quite significantly in Yolo County, since these school districts have made commitments and policies to focus on purchasing from regional growers. So how then can we use food policies to engage our communities in our food systems? And policymakers such as yourselves are really important players. I think the things that you could do are creating economic spaces, making it easier to develop new sustainable food businesses or economic exchanges between local growers and institutions, cooperatives. You could help build environmental spaces by ensuring farmland is available, or beekeeping or chicken keeping is possible in urban areas, and help urban agriculture and urban farms to thrive. Then there's social spaces, new ways of interacting so that all people in the food system are respected and have a voice in the development of their food systems. And finally, the political spaces, which you're all experts in, creating new policies and regulations that support accessible, transparent rules that people can understand and that provide financial incentives for more resilient food system initiatives. And really, I think it's more than the policymakers. There's a number of food system and health agencies here today. There's educators, there's researchers. I think all of us need to be involved in this effort. We need diversity, we need imagination, we need democratic participation to move our food system to a place where it's engaging all of us in building a more sustainable future. So I'll end there. Do I take questions now, or?
Let's do a couple
And then move on, okay. Yes?
You mentioned that the best level to do these food assessments are at the county level.
That's what our experience has been.
How many of California's counties actually undergone county?
We've done, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've done about 6 or 7 of them ourselves, but a number of counties have done their own ones that are a little bit more informal and not as data-driven. So there's all different ways that they can be done. So, and
How many counties are in California?
50-something. So there's a few, and I'm just telling you the ones I know of, and probably another 10, 15 have done some sort of assessment as well. If you're interested in seeing what they actually look like, you can go to our website, and we have like 5 of them up on our website, including the San Diego one and one we just finished in San Luis Obispo, and we're about ready to start one in Kern County, which is in the Central Valley. Yes.
Can you speak to, talking about that data, can you speak to how it was collected, who collected it, and how it was organized, and who funded that?
Yeah, it's been funded a number of different ways. We generally take the lead in the data collection because it's easier for us as a research institution to put that's what we do. The community helps design it and identify what the goals and indicators are because it's their work, it's their goals. And let's see what you say. So we collect the information. We get as much as we can from online. We do a lot of interviews. The people that are involved in the organization that is leading the food system assessment are often partners of ours. Lots of time they're in the public health field, and they have their own access to data that they share with us or point us where to go. A lot of people have colleagues that are in the data gathering business themselves, and so we make it, we translate it in a way that more people can understand it. And then it's been funded by nonprofits. California Endowment funded it. It's been funded by the specialty crop block grants in our state. It's another source. And foundations, other foundations. And also some regional research money that we have through the Hatch Act has helped. Should we stop there? Okay.
Gail, you mentioned your website, and I was looking through our book, and I don't see it in here. So let's make sure we get it for you, and any of you that want to have that before you leave will do that. So, Mark, we'll have you begin next.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Vale. Thank you, Gail. That was a terrific presentation, and I'm probably just going to be embellishing on certain points. It's an honor to be here in Kentucky. I think it's my fourth or fifth time. I've had a chance to be here in the past. Actually, I think 2 times in speaking with groups in Louisville, which, as you can tell by the way I pronounce it, indicates that I'm not from here. Nevertheless, I've had a chance to be here and work with groups that are interested and have worked with food policy councils. Let's see, do I... I
think there's someone coming to us.
Oh, it's coming to my rescue. There we go. Okay. So, as you can see, I have been involved with community food system work for a long time, my entire career, in fact, and much of that has included food policy, local food policy, and state food policy, and the formation of food policy councils. I tell a quick story about why I got involved in food policy. And it really goes to my work that I was doing in the city of Hartford, Connecticut, which many people don't know is actually a rather low-income place that had a number of serious food challenges. And as a virtual youngster out of college, I went there with the idea that we were going to create farmers markets, community gardens, co-ops, and we were basically going to solve most of our problems, within a year or two. Well, I was disappointed. And I tried very hard to make all these things happen. And I found that ultimately I needed help, and that the group work I was doing on the ground, neighborhood by neighborhood, was not going to be enough. So I got the bright idea of going to our state government and our Department of Agriculture, and then later to our Department of Health and our Department of Education, and asking how can they participate, and this is in the 70s and 80s, how can they participate more in the work that we're trying to do to solve some very serious food problems in the city of Hartford? And they began to contribute in different ways. And just one example was looking at the development of farmers markets, where we found that, yes, we could organize farmers markets maybe one a year, particularly in lower income neighborhoods where the need was really significant. But we needed more help from state government. So they came and put in some money that actually provided for the development of something called the Farmers Market Nutrition Program. And that provided an incentive to low-income families to shop at farmers markets. Now, that to me was my first act, you might say, of food policy. And it was probably the first time that the state decided that they could become involved and make a difference. Well, we went in a course of 15 years. We went from about 15 farmers markets to 130 around the state, largely because of the incentives that were being provided by state government. And at the same time, low-income families were increasing their consumption of fresh local food. It was a win-win for everybody, and it was not going to happen because of an individual organization or nonprofit or organizers trying to make farmers markets grow. So my lesson there is about the role of partnerships with government, that we can work very closely with all levels of government to have a much greater impact on our food system for everybody, all the stakeholders, from consumers to producers. So I want to just point out a couple of one website in particular, foodpolicynetworks.org. I am associated now with the Center for a Livable Future at Johns Hopkins University. We are working to be a center or a hub for food policy at the local and state level, and for helping food policy councils become more effective and to develop new ones. You'll find a tremendous number of resources at this website, including a database with over 600 documents related to food assessments, food system studies, model ordinances, statutes, policies, a long list of really good and regularly updated documents from all over, actually from all over North America. So I would encourage you to check that out. You'll find other resources as well. So I have worked with food policy councils as a founder of the Hartford Food Policy Council in Hartford, Connecticut, which is actually the second longest running food policy council in the country, Knoxville, Tennessee being the first one that was founded in the early 1980s. I was also the co-founder of the State of Connecticut Food Policy Council, which is the oldest food policy council, state food policy council in the country. And I like this quote because I've learned one thing, and it's that the more people we can get involved in solving problems, the better off we're going to be. It's about participation, it's about community engagement, it's about multiple stakeholders, input, and the food system gives you a lot of opportunity to bring in different people from different sectors. And the more people we can have looking at a problem, the more solutions we're going to develop, and the more likely we're going to end up with something that's productive. And that's what I learned from Amartya Sen, a Nobel laureate economist, about how democracy can reduce the effects of famine and other very serious food security failures across the globe. What do food policy councils do? Well, this is just a few general thoughts. They are clearly there to try to influence policy. Policy is in their name. There's a bit of a debate over this sometimes because a lot of groups get into this work and they're much more interested in running food programs and food projects. They want to get their hands dirty, so to speak, and that makes a lot of sense, and that's often where people start. But like me, they kind of grow and they see that there is an opportunity for government to become more engaged. So we're interested in how looking at the huge range of government functions and activities, everything from statutes to budgetary appropriations to regulations to administrative action, to simply having a key political figure get up and speak in favor of certain kinds of food issues is a way that policy can make a difference in our food system. We also see that food policy councils do a good job of coordinating all these food system stakeholders. I mean, we have agriculture, we have education, we have extension, we have health and environment and economic development. That's a big, long list of people who are engaged in our food system. And I mean, you can look at it in terms of departments, of course, but think about it just in terms of our local economies. Think about it in terms of our communities and how big that food system is, and that we do not have a common table around which to sit. One of my colleagues has said that no place in government is there a department of food. And consider how big our food system is and how scattered the functions are within government that have some impact on our food system. It's important to have a place to bring people together, and that's what food policy councils try to do. They have, in some case, like the term controversy, confrontation, there's a lot of agitation and concern and angst, of course, in our food system about certain practices, and we've seen a lot of problems as a result of people making poor food choices and the impacts on our environment. Food policy councils haven't really been the place where we've waded into those big fights or those big battles, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. They tend to be the place where we find some really good low-hanging fruit and good diligent work, the kind that Gail described in San Diego, where some results can happen. That's where food policy councils tend to put their energy. And of course, food assessments and preparing plans to actually be intentional about our food system. Let's have a plan. I mean, this is probably the most important thing we can do in our communities, is to think about the future of our food supply. And we're not doing that. We don't have a place there we come together and plan intentionally about food and making sure we have a good supply of healthy food far into the future. So food policy councils are places where that can happen. Just some numbers and descriptive materials, or descriptive items. Looking down at the bottom, we can see the growth in food policy councils over just 4 years. This is based on census work that we're doing at Johns Hopkins, following and tracking food policy councils over a period of time. On that website I gave you, you'll also find a directory of all the food policy. Well, not all. We have teams of graduate students who run around and call people up, and they can be rather annoying in trying to collect information. And it's hard sometimes to get everything, but this is a pretty good summary of what we know so far. We have about 20 state food policy councils, which presumably is what you're looking at more here in Kentucky. But you can see most of the food policy councils are local, meaning that they're municipal, city. Sometimes they're metropolitan, as I believe what people were trying to do in Louisville. And then we have a few county, and we have a few tribal food policy councils as well. This means that this is the geography and the jurisdiction that they're organized around. It doesn't mean that they are when I say local, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are a part of, say, city government. It's important to be clear about that. Sometimes we have local food policy councils that are very private in the sense of not having an official sanction from local government, in the same way that we have state food policy councils, like you'll hear from New Mexico, which are not formally a part of state government. However, the really defining factor with respect to food policy councils, and the one that I think makes the most difference, is that you have a good, strong, collaborative approach between the private sector and the public sector. Whether you're sanctioned officially through statute or executive order or local ordinance or resolution, it's most important that you have participation by key people within government, key departments, elected officials, and that you are trying to be as collaborative as possible and sharing information across those different, whether it's departmental lines or sharing it across sector lines or other food system categories. What do? As I said, there's no Department of Food, but in effect, they sometimes act as a de facto Department of Food. They're there to do food system planning. Their membership is very comprehensive in that they represent government, academia, certainly various members of the community, agriculture, faith communities. And some of this will be influenced, of course, about whether or not you're doing this locally or at a state level. But state level, you won't necessarily have as many representatives from lots of different groups. At a local level, you'll tend to see a lot more individuals and smaller groups participating in food policy councils. Again, the same functions that I've already mentioned, and that food policy councils actually are there to advise policymakers. We're there to give information that I think you can only uniquely assemble when you have the right experts in the room. And not just experts in terms of professional credentials, but also experts in terms of community representation and community voices, speaking up about what they need and what their hopes are. Organizationally, some councils, state councils, for instance, are created by a state statute. That was the case in Connecticut back in the late 1990s. We actually went through a 2-year process with our legislature. First step was to actually put together a study bill that looked at the feasibility of establishing a food policy council and what it would do and how it would operate and so forth. What's the need? Also, it was kind of you might say it was a bit of a quick and dirty kind of assessment, food system assessment for the state of Connecticut that provided what we felt was the important argument for creating a food policy council. Sometimes they're created by a local ordinance. Douglas County, Kansas, which is where Lawrence, Kansas is, University of Kansas, is an example where a local ordinance was used to create this is actually a joint county-city group. We have executive orders that establish food policy councils in North Carolina, Michigan, Ohio, Iowa. In other words, the governor took action to create a food policy council. And then councils that are independent, operating independently. You'll hear about New Mexico as an example of that. A few may operate also under the aegis of a nonprofit organization. Having a single strong nonprofit or other non-governmental agency as a backbone organization is often a very critical organizational need for food policy councils. Now, just some commentary on this. We're finding that as political winds change, it's generally best to try to have something either established firmly within government, such that it's not going to go away when administrations change, or to have strong outside non-governmental groups or backbone organizations. In other words, independent councils. It's definitely, and I don't want to shy away from the questions of controversy and which really haven't been the cause of any of the problems. It's really been more that political interests change, and that it's best to try to make sure there's a fairly substantial way for a food policy council to continue when administrations change. So that's just my political advice. In the case of Connecticut, it has been, the food policy council is still there because it was built into the state via statute. In the case of New Mexico, it operates very well as an independent organization with a strong backbone organization. Equity is very much at the forefront of concerns about food policy council. While a number of issues, many different issues, are addressed by food policy councils, some of which aren't necessarily sensitive to income issues or income disparities or other equity concerns. Many of them are, and they should be, because this is often where we see some of the greatest problems within our food system. So the composition of the Food Policy Council does need to reflect that of the community, the makeup of the community. There needs to really be a commitment to community engagement. This isn't just a place where experts are going to meet and make decisions. Okay, this is not an elite body of decision makers or policy experts. This is a place where community voices will also be heard. The policy issues that people choose to work on are those that should have the most impact on those who are the most vulnerable in the community. Not exclusively, not only, but they need to be at the top of the list. And there needs to be, in terms of how the food policy councils are structured, there needs to be a balance between policymakers, stakeholders, and grassroots groups. They should not be top-down kinds of organizations. They should really be almost flat in the sense of having equal voices. Imagine, a flat kind of hierarchy, not one that is top-down. Gail already gave you a look at assessments, but assessments are always a critical part, particularly an early part of any food policy or food policy council action. I won't go. It's there to inform the work of the council. What are we going to do? Well, we don't know what we're going to do unless we know what the problems are. It's pretty simple that way. And so we want to be able to get a good sense of what's going on. We want to use this as an opportunity to engage our community. We want to make sure we really understand our food system. I so many times have been in a room with people who are experts. Well, we have an expert on education who can tell us all about food programs in schools. We have people involved in agriculture and foods and who are farmers, and they can tell us all about that. But no one can tell you very much about the other activities within the food system. That's what we want to learn from a food assessment, that we can all educate one another. So I'm just going to leave that at that. One thing, this is probably a bias that I have. I don't know, Gail might disagree with me, but I don't think that we should overdo assessments. I've seen groups that I said, God, you couldn't possibly be continuing your assessment, could you, at this point? I mean, don't you want to do something? And there is a little bit of that agitation that we want to get good information, but we want to start using it as quickly as possible. And I also say that assessment is not a one-time, put it on the shelf kind of activity. It's ongoing. We always want to know what's going on in our food system. So we keep at it all the time, but we don't overdo it.
I'm agreeing.
Okay. Whew. What do we do with it? Well, some of us have moved more formally through Food Policy Council work to the creation of a food plan or charter. Not always do we do it this way, but I'm leaning myself where I've been kind of an ad hoc, let's get something going quickly kind of guy. I've been, maybe as I get older, I want to do more planning. I want to be more thoughtful and intentional. So we're seeing this evolution of food planning and food charters across the country, local and state level. And this really does set the stage for some good action. And it also, interestingly enough, is a way to sort of minimize some of the tension that can be created when a new idea comes along and there's many different stakeholders involved. Because the planning process gets people around the table and they find out what they can agree on, what their common denominators are, and maybe pushes those boundaries just a little bit. And I'll give you an example of what I think is a really good example of state-level food planning in a moment. But I want to emphasize this next to last bullet, which is the plan is more a means than an end. It's a way of learning about your food system. It's a way of coming together as a group and deciding what your policy agenda ought to be. And it tends to kind of, as I said, minimize a lot of that tension that comes often from just not knowing who people are and what their interests are. If there's one word that I want you to remember about food policy councils, it's relationships. It's about relationship building across lines where people, I can sit in a room with somebody who I know they're from that particular group, and I don't really like that group, so therefore I don't like that person, right? Well, food policy councils have been a way to sort of bridge some of those barriers. And I've learned that I can actually start to work with that person and even that group, even though I have some serious disagreements with what they're doing. And we've seen some really positive outcomes as a result of that. Minnesota is the example I want to use for a food plan. You can find it on our Food Policy Council Network site. It was just launched this past October. 2-year process, funding from Minnesota Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation. They didn't have a single backbone organization. However, the Cooperative Extension Service there played a very significant role in this 2-year process. There were local food policy councils very much involved, looking at collective impacts. In other words, coming up with common agenda, common goals, a measurement process, evaluation process, and so forth. They had 2,500 participants, 200 events, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see it was quite extensive, quite statewide. If there's a Cadillac version of a food plan and food assessment, this is it. If Cadillac is even the right car metaphor anymore, I'm not sure. So out of that process, they It was a major investment in relationship and network building, and that probably is the biggest and most important outcome at this stage. You can just see a few policy recommendations that came right out of that. And interestingly, I found in this process is that they got agreement on just about everything in that document, from government agencies, from different food system stakeholders, from the bottom up and the top down in the course of going through this. And you can see the Healthy Food Financing Initiative is to actually put money into the development of good, affordable, healthy food retail outlets in communities that are underserved by those kinds of places, offer more high nutrition food at state food pantries, and actually provide tax credits to farmers for donated food to food pantries. These are just a few of their recommendations. And the only area that they pointed to is where there was controversy and pushback, just to make sure that it isn't all just a kumbaya, big hug moment for everybody, was that because they have a very large sugar beet industry in Minnesota, they could not make any headway on taxes on sugary soft drinks. They took that off the table. That's what they did. And they said, all right, we'll work on these other things because we have a lot of common ground here that we can work on. Other food policy, I'm just going to highlight, food policy, I just want to highlight a few actions. It's such a big world. There's so much to talk about. And I came so far. And the other thing is, so cities and states putting up money to promote more supermarkets in underserved communities, optimizing the use of federal food programs. There's so many there's 15 or 16 federal nutrition programs. All of them kind of sift through state agencies and state government. We need to make sure we're optimizing the use of those funds as much as possible. Public transportation is another area where we've been able to, if we can connect areas that are not well served by supermarkets and connect the people living there to supermarkets, we can do a lot to have a positive impact on their diets. Procurement has been a very big area. You've already heard about Los Angeles. You'll hear about New Mexico. But using public dollars to support local food systems and local agriculture and local health and build economic security in communities has been a very positive policy direction. Farmland preservation has been Connecticut, this was probably one of our biggest areas of success, was in farmland preservation. You'll hear about nutrition rules in the schools, better focus on the farm economy in Michigan was the work of their Food Policy Council. Similarly in Illinois. Comprehensive food planning. If we're going to do food planning at a state level or a local level, let's make sure that food is on the table, farming is on the table. That makes a big difference in the conversation, and we're seeing a lot more of that now across the country. I'm going to skip over Cleveland. We are seeing more funding for food policy councils. Some of it is some federal money. We're seeing a lot more community foundations supporting food policy council work. States, counties, and cities have put up money to support food policy councils, and there's often a lot of in-kind support coming from universities, extension, and larger nonprofit institutions. Anywhere from one full-time to sometimes up to 3 to 4 people full-time. City of Los Angeles has 6 full-time staff people with their food policy council. That's another Cadillac-type food policy council. Lessons learned. This is where we need to be paying attention to our own organizational effectiveness. Sometimes we don't do that. I've seen a lot of problems as a result. We need to be inclusive of a number of food system interests. The community has to be engaged. Yes, we can have good, robust debates about food system issues of the day, but we need to also find solutions and remember that we are a solution-oriented body. We need to be educating each of us all the time. We need to have good communication coming from these groups outward to the public, outward to policymakers, but also internally. And oftentimes we overlook that. We need to be setting measurable goals. We need to be evaluating our work regularly. Food assessments is an ongoing enterprise, and there is synergy between different levels of government and policy that we have to be conscious of. And lastly, good facilitation. Think about all these different people in a room with different interests, different agendas. It would be a challenging job to be a facilitator in that situation. It's not, we shouldn't, the person who happens to get up and go to the bathroom at the time that you're deciding that who the chair of the group is going to be is not the way to select the leader. Work with people and make sure they have the right facilitation skills. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a couple of questions for Mark? You will have an opportunity at the end as well. So.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much.
switch
Oh, yeah,
your-
that's a good idea, huh? Uh-oh.
Here it
I'll
comes.
it's always equipment challenges for myself, but anyway, yeah, thank you. Perfect. Let's make sure I know how to do this, right? So, many thanks, obviously, to you all for the invitation to be here today. My name is Pam Roy, and I'm the executive director of an organization called Farm to Table in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and also the coordinator of the New Mexico Food and Agriculture Policy Council. And just give a brief background on how I got involved with those issues, because it's sort of relevant to my colleagues, Gail and Mark, of whom I've known both of them actually for about the same period of time, about the last 25 years. I hate to age myself in this. They aren't young. I mean, they're young, and I'm not anymore. It'll age you, let me put it that way. I think it's really important, because this is work that we've been doing for a long time. And what I've learned, certainly through this work, is that it takes some time. Mark mentioned that. And we can't just get things done in a day. And it's about building partnerships and coalitions and an understanding across sectors, which I'll get into. So that 20 plus years ago, I was actually developing farmers markets in New Mexico, and was actually fundraising for a permanent facility with the Santa Fe Farmers Market, which is now considered a top market in the United States, which I'm really proud of. At the time, farmers markets were just getting going, so my focus was more on small to medium-sized agriculture and working with farmers and ranchers, especially farmers who are vegetable and fruit producers in New Mexico that didn't have a lot of market outlets. Apple producers were actually throwing their apples away. And they weren't even getting into food banks and places like that at that time. And at that time, I was really interested in these burgeoning programs, and Mark mentioned it. We had Mark come out about 20 plus years ago to tell us about the WIC, Women, Infant, and Children Farmers Market Nutrition Program. And so we were one of those front-end states that actually brought that program to New Mexico. And why would I bring that up? Well, because it was also my first time over 20 years ago to be at our legislature, in front of our legislators, asking for matching funds to bring some federal dollars home for the Women, Infant, and Children Farmers Market Nutrition Program, linking our children and families to local produce and the things that are being sold by our farmers. So the win-win in all of that. And at the time, the Women, Infant, and Children program didn't have fruits and vegetables as part of its package. How many in the room are familiar with WIC? Just curious. So most, right, okay. How many are in agriculture here in the room? Good, that's great to have some, good. So in any case, we realized that there was a lot of work to be done. It was my first time in front of the legislature. I haven't left those hallways since, other than to come here. No, I'm only teasing. Actually, because our bill was presented yesterday, and I'll get to that in just a few minutes, a little bit more about what we're doing with our Food Policy Council. So what I understood was there were three things. There are three Ps. There's programs, Mark talked about, many of us are doing programs in our communities around food and farming and agriculture and health, and the environment. And then many of us are partnering to do these various activities. And the third, that's two Ps. The third P is the policy part. And we need all three to really work and create a sustainable and wholesome food and agriculture system that really includes our families and starts with everybody at home and in the workplace, et cetera. And Gail, actually, I'm going to actually get some of your slides, because I have one up here that I want to change out to show your circle of how we see all these things collectively. So just briefly, so our Food Policy Council started about 12 years ago. And again, it was an outcome of recognizing the need to really bring partners together and have people come and have that conversation. And Mark said the public and private sectors. So our Food Policy Council in New Mexico, our statewide one, is a public-private sector partnership. It's health, environment, economic development, agriculture, human services at the table all at one time, and then the private sector side of that, farmers markets and food banks and other organizations that really embed and embody a lot of the programmatic work in our communities. How we look at it, though, is access to healthy and affordable foods, especially in lower income and tribal communities, is a major basis to our work. Access to markets that provide fair prices for farmers and ranchers, and to assess, access to decision makers and policymakers. So the idea that we really need to be working on these things together. So our policymakers, whether it be our city councilors, county commissioners, or state legislators, and our congressional leadership, are our partners in this work, and that's very key to it. So similar to Gail, except mine looks a little more linear at this point, but we look at food and farming systems as this we're overarching. All the pieces create the whole. So it's not only about that farmer all the way to the consumer and the supply chain or value chain, as some call it as well, in between. It's also embedded in that the physical environment, economic, the political, and the socio-cultural aspects of our communities. In New Mexico, we're a tricultural state for the most part. And so the base of our state, of course, is a Hispanic population, Native American, Anglo, and then we have a lot of other community members, too. We are a border state to Mexico as well, so we have a very large immigrant population. And so we need to take everybody into consideration when it comes to who they are, the families that they are, the children that are in our state. And that, again, fits in this whole larger scenario. So we begin our work when we're invited in many ways, although we also really look at issues as a Food Policy Council that are burgeoning and or are really in our face. Equity is a huge issue for us. Mark and Gail both brought that up in their presentations. And we see health and health equity in all policies, no matter what we do, whether it be on the farm, out in our farmlands, and really think about what our farmers and ranchers need. But what about the health and the stewardship of the land and our water resources in New Mexico? Water is a big issue for us where we are, all the way to what ends up on the plate and the health of that plate. So I'm going to give an example of what our Food Policy Council has been working on. And in your booklet, I do want to share as well, on page 15 to 16 is a chronology. It's a real summary. This is much more in-depth than this, of some of the work that our Food Policy Council has been doing, working on state and federal issues. Now, having said that, our work around farm to cafeteria and farm to school has been actually sort of at the epicenter of that work. We started thinking about how can we actually influence the health of an actual population. We felt that children were probably the best place to start because that also is about families as well. And communities, right? Because our kids are so much a part of our communities. In New Mexico, we're a large geographic state with a small population, so it might not feel quite the same here. It might be the opposite almost. But we felt like really looking at what ends up in that plate in the schools and where it comes from is an important place to start when it comes to the health of our kids and our communities. So just really briefly, in New Mexico, about 22% of our third graders are considered obese. Part of our work, we've done food assessments. We also created a food gap task force statewide that was governor appointed to really look at access and the lack of access to food. And that, again, brought us to this as being one of our major subjects. And really the prevalence of our health issues in New Mexico, obesity, diabetes, and they are directly correlated through much of our studies to have to do with not only being able to get food in urban communities, but because we're such a rural state, we have people who will travel as much as 140 miles round trip to get to a grocery store, and more than 10% of our population actually do not have cars, and most of those people are in rural communities. So that's a big issue. On the Navajo Nation, you'll see actually grandmothers actually hitchhiking to get food, and they might be hitchhiking 30, 40, 50 miles one way. One of the other statistics in bringing up the Navajo Nation, when we look at 22% of our third graders are considered obese, on the Navajo Nation that ramps up to about 35%, 50% of those who live on the Navajo Nation do participate in the SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And again, that has to do with food access and the lack of an economy in that area because it's very rural. So it sort of just sets the stage for, what we have to work on. So again, back to schools and what we decided to do. We said we really want students to get the most value out of their meals, since all schools tend to, other than our private schools, to provide a meal program. Now many of our schools provide breakfast, lunch, and dinner in New Mexico, and after-school snack programs. So again, trying to meet and bridge the needs of children in our state. So, and not only do we want to provide healthy options, we really want to link it to our own agricultural economy. And so this has been a really huge initiative for our farmers, in particular fruit and vegetable producers. And we really want to be able to meet the federal meals guidelines as well that schools have to work on or have to abide by. So state, local, and tribal farmers, farm-to-school and farm-to-cafeteria policies are the ones we've been working on. Again, tribal community issues are somewhat different. We want to make sure that culturally significant foods are also addressed and schools are able to put those on the plate and still meet the federal dietary guidelines. And then so here's where I'm going to start really quickly on how do we stage this. In 2005, we decided we would work on the competitive food rules in the schools. And both Mark and Gail brought this up in both of their presentations a bit. Changing what's in the institution, not just what's on the plate in the cafeteria, but what are the other things that compete with a school meal or school breakfast program. And those were the vending machines in the schools. So we were actually one of the first states, and this was one of our first most aggressive pieces of legislation. And again, it was the Public Education Department, the Department of Agriculture, Co-op Extension, the Health Department in the room with the private sector, like the New Mexico Pediatrics Association, the New Mexico School Nutrition Association, all in the room together saying, you know what, this would be something we all need to work on. So let's minimize the competitive foods in the schools. And it was done through state legislation. Took over a year because we did a lot of community input. The Public Education Department had to actually host 5 different community-wide meetings. And the soda industries literally sent their lobbyists from Washington, D.C. to fight against us changing these rules for schools. So the good news is in a year's time, the governor was able to promulgate new rules, New Mexico being one of the first 3 in the state, in the nation, to actually change those and minimize competitive foods. Still, though, we have to do what we call administrative advocacy as a food policy council. We work with those departments. We are out in the schools, not about being the bad guy, but what are the issues? Why do DECA clubs keep selling product in the schools? It's because they need to be able to raise some funds. So then what can we do to change that? And as a food policy council, we look at all of those pieces as much as possible. At the same time, we were working on getting New Mexico grown fresh fruits and vegetables in the schools. So we've been running a piece of legislation called New Mexico Fresh Fruits and Vegetables for School Meals. And in fact, yesterday, I missed our hearing testifying. We have House Bill 96. We've been requesting $1.44 million for our schools as an state investment into the school meal program to meet the needs of our schools to purchase New Mexico grown fresh fruits and vegetables. It's a little more expensive. And how many are familiar with the child nutrition reauthorization at the federal level, right? So that's what guides, obviously, what happens in the schools. It's the federal regulations. because in the late, 2005, 2006, 7, 8, we set the stage with our State Food Policy Council to be able to work effectively with national groups and with our federal legislators on the child nutrition reauthorization. We had already set the stage to improve the nutrition standards, get more fresh fruits and vegetables on school meal plates, or at least twice as many fruits and vegetables, even if they're not fresh, and to change the competitive food rules. So we were sort of ahead of the game. We already had that broad sector, public-private sector policy embedded in the work, and we had our state and federal policymakers on board to really be there to push for change at the federal level. So then, at the federal level, those new standards came home, and we had already really set the stage for those standards. So that's helped us be able to maintain and continue to build on this. At the same time, though, when the new standards came to New Mexico and all of us, doubling the fruits and vegetables on the plates, it meant that there was a price differentiation there. And that's why we've been advocating at the state level through our state legislature for some additional funds for that program. At the same time, we're working to build into that legislation education, the development of education programs, and this year our legislation has a full-time person that would be embedded in the public education department. This is a collaborative between the Department of Agriculture and the Public Education Department, and we work very closely with the Secretaries of Agriculture and Public Education to keep moving this program forward, both inside those agencies as well as outside of them. So I'm just going to quickly run. Positive change. Mark mentioned choose things that are, we hope, easy wins, as we might say. Well, it takes time. And we've learned a lot in the sense of what those relationships are about. Our public education department hasn't been as excited about these programs as we have wanted them to be. But what we've done is worked on the practical, on the ground, in community side of this work. So we work with our farmers and our school food service directors to understand what are the policies that are required, the procurement policies that are required. And there's a bid process and all that, right? So we've learned what it means for the public education department to actually house this program and embed additional funding and a whole new program to get local on the plate. And so we've learned to understand what those rules are, and we've worked with them on all of the legal issues all along the way. We've also advocated for what's called geographic preference. Schools had to take the lowest bid, which meant a lot of our farmers were out of the opportunity to be able to sell to the schools. We worked at the federal level to get that changed. So now all states and all school districts can choose to pay a little bit more or do it a little bit different to be able to buy local. So wrapping it up. As I mentioned, partners are really important. Mark and Gail brought that up. That public-private policy and corporate part of that, those sectors, and then embedded in that are all of these others: agriculture, economic development, education, environment, transportation, and institutions. And that brings me to one of our most recent projects and programs was to actually assess, and this slide doesn't talk about it, but assess how public institutions are procuring food in New Mexico. So we not only looked at schools, which we already had a fairly good understanding about the schools, hospitals, senior centers, and the corrections facilities. $9 million of food that's purchased by institutions. This was a collaboration and still is a collaboration with our New Mexico State University and the Cooperative Extension Service as our teammates doing the research. They're working on learning more, still a little bit more on the farm side of it. What's available, what's not available, and how do farmers get involved. And we're looking at the price points, all the regulatory issues, so that we can begin to continue to embed more of our New Mexico grown and raised, it could be meat, it could be the dairy and the produce, into some of our institutions like senior centers and hospitals besides the schools. Our corrections facilities are really excited about it, but at the juvenile detention center level, because they actually have to use the school nutrition rules. So it really embeds, and they see these young people come into those facilities who really need to have some guidance, create some good life choices for themselves. And two of our detention centers actually have greenhouses and hoop houses and are really embedding the idea of programmatic work into what ends up on the plate. So we're excited about that. So I've already talked about some of the partners, Farm to Cafeteria. One of the things, and our commissioner today who's with us, we were talking about the Food Safety Modernization Act. So part of our work, this is a federal initiative that's coming, and we will all be working towards having safe food. I think our food system here in the United States is incredibly safe. But on our end, as a Food Policy Council and as an organization, we look at what are those rules that might be coming our way and how can we jumpstart and make sure all of our farmers are aware of those rules and are doing things like quality management systems development on farm, traceability, where their product comes from off the farm, putting labels on the boxes. We work with Co-op Extension with an education training program with our Department of Agriculture, and then with a third-party certification program from out of state so that we begin to ramp up so that we're ready for those rules when they come to New Mexico. One of our next pieces and efforts is to look at all. As Mark mentioned, there are 15 federal nutrition programs that we all have something to do with at the federal level. We're going to look at those that affect nutrition in the schools, physical activity, and look at them as a big picture. We want to see how these programs are being used. Many of them are federal, like the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Snack Program, school meal program, after-school programs, summer meal programs, and then some of the physical activity pieces. See how all of them relate to each other, and then where are the relationships not there? How well is funding being spent? What are some of the barriers in our rural communities? Our Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Snack Program is not actually a program in many of the schools, and our tribal communities. We want to understand, is it administrative? Does it make it too hard? Or are there other reasons why schools may not be utilizing those programs? So with that, back to this idea of healthy kids and a healthy economy, kind of funny grid that we looked at before. We just want to create new markets for farmers and ranchers. We really want to create new opportunities for local entrepreneurs who are coming into this food and farming systems work. And we really want to create the capacity to provide healthy foods in our communities, as well as we really want to help develop lifelong opportunities for not only our kids but our families. But kids are the ones, right, to learn about healthier eating options and to really take care of themselves as they move on and become adults in our communities. I have a lot of other materials. Actually, Gail brought up the Double Bucks program at farmers markets. Tomorrow, we will be testifying at our state legislature, asking them to assist us with a Double Bucks program, with a supplemental nutrition assistance program in New Mexico. We've had that program in New Mexico, and we're a pilot state to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to access fresh, locally grown foods, and in particular those who are most vulnerable. So I have a few other materials and happy to share, and look forward to questions for sure. Yes.
Can you share a little
Joanne.
bit more about how the council's been working with some of the challenges found in the rural communities, as well as transportation and access?
Joanne, great question. So Joanne asked about how our New Mexico Food and Agriculture Policy Council is really figuring out the access issue in rural communities. We did an early on report, and it's mentioned a little bit in this guideline. We worked with local government and community governments as well to, and it was a year-long report to really find out how people are accessing food, and it's called Closing the Food Gap. New Mexico's Closing the Food Gap. Again, early on state, this was before USDA decided to call it food deserts, which I really, really resent that, but because there's a lot of food out in deserts where we are. But it's amazing what a desert can provide. So in any case, we did a lot of work around that, using really an assessment approach to it. Did a lot of fact-finding. We reached out into communities. We did dinners out in very rural communities and in tribal communities. And we still do that. We're working now with an organization on the Navajo Nation that really wants to try and figure out how to get fresh foods into mostly convenience and gas station stores, because that's what's prevalent out in rural communities where there are no fresh fruits and vegetables in many of these stores. A few trading posts, and again, they're about 60 miles away from places. We're working also in kind of a coalition of organizations and agencies that are really looking at distribution across the state. So one of the things with the schools, because we are a very large geographic state, to be able to move farmers' product around the state, we partnered with our Human Services Department, which is the Food and Nutrition Services Bureau. They're required to actually distribute all of the federal donated foods to schools. And some are vegetables and fruits. They have trucks going all over the state and all throughout the year. And so we actually piggyback farmers' product on their trucks to get out into some of the most rural areas of the state. And schools can order, and we get that order on those trucks, and they get it out there. So during the wintertime, their trucks are not temperature controlled, so we've been trying to actually create a relationship with our statewide food bank association to do something similar, because they have really nice trucks. I've learned to really like trucks a lot, especially the refrigerated. I drive a truck, but the refrigerated ones, I'm really loving that kind of thing. But now what we want to do is map out where are the facilities. This sheet, actually, so we're working as a coalition not only on farm-to-school legislation and farmers market legislation, but on infrastructure legislation to create infrastructure areas like food hubs. I know that's a trendy way of saying it, but aggregation areas in communities, potentially using kitchens that may have been closed, like community kitchens in rural areas, that could still be a place to aggregate and have trucks coming in and out of. And then we want to look at what trucks, what commercial trucks, private trucks, and nonprofit trucks run across the state that actually carry food, so that we can potentially begin to build more of a relationship and partnerships with vehicles that are already on the road, infrastructure that already exists, so the investment is less, hopefully, than more, and creating the relationships that can build, that really hopefully will be permanent in those situations. So I hope, did that get closer to a question? Yeah. So it's not just a report that we put on a shelf. So actually, any other questions before I think the three of us get an opportunity, and Janet's going to wrap us up.
And we'll give everybody a chance
Great.
for it.
Perfect. Great, thank you.
A little relationship building.
Yeah,
I'm Janet Mullins, and I'm from University of Kentucky, and I'm happy to be here with you all today. What we try to bring to the table is a family lens. And so what I'm going to try to do is to wrap it up using Kentucky families as the lens at which we look at food. And building strong Kentucky families involves a good, strong food system. And we've heard today that it has implications for health, for the economy, and for the environment. And so those are the things that we hope will be the subject of continued conversation in the state with a food policy council. We've had some great partners to work with, and I'm going to talk about some of their work. Part of the reason that this work is important is because everyone eats. And so when you make those food choices, it has an impact on your personal health, on the physical environment in which we live, and on the economic opportunities, not just for farmers, but also to help lift families out of poverty by providing them with opportunities to become employed in the food system. It really offers an opportunity for new jobs as well. This is the socio-ecological model that we often use in our School of Human Environmental Sciences work, what used to be called home economics. We have tried to help individuals and families at the center of the model But we know that if we move the work to the outer circles, where we have policy, environmental, and systems changes, those powerful changes make it easier for everyone to eat healthy. And so that is why policy councils who talk about food are so important. We've been reforming national food policy, and the most recent example of that is the recent Farm Bill. Among other things, the Farm Bill makes it easier to use SNAP benefits to purchase local foods, provides funding to farmers markets, and also reforms federal insurance programs that work better to protect organic and diversified farms, which tend to be smaller farmers. We have many of them in Kentucky. When I did a little homework, this is a graphic that I came across when I just searched for food policy in the .gov domain. And it is from a congresswoman from Maine. And they have put together this graphic that illustrates my plate choices, making half your plate fruits and vegetables, for example, as healthy choices, versus what some of our federal ag subsidies support. And so this is an example of some of the kinds of policy conversations we could have about how to align our food system with good health and good economic opportunity for our agricultural producers. So I'm going to bring into summary now some of the things that our guest speakers have said. And so these are some of the things that Pam Roy brought to us about how policymakers can help create these opportunities to talk about food and to make decisions for the good of all of us. Mark Winnie shared with us some of the lessons learned, and I believe that perhaps he may be the person in the United States with the most lessons learned about food policy councils. And so, Mark, we thank you for sharing these with us, and we will try to learn from your good experience. And then finally, Gail brought to us this lovely model where we look at how the concerns of health, the economy, and stewardship of environmental resources intersect in a sustainable food system. So we would like to think about what would be the advantages of having a functioning food policy council here in Kentucky to creating the kind of spaces that Gail talked about. And one of the recent reports and good work that has come from the Community Farm Alliance, and you have a link to this report in your briefing, is building a grassroots-driven food policy network in Kentucky. And Martin Richards, Martin, would you wave, from Community Farm Alliance and his organization have done a lot of good work. We have done community food assessments in Kentucky. In particular, they have been done down in Bowling Green, in Berea, working on them over in Floyd County, done a little bit in Louisville and Lexington. And so there has been some community food system assessment work done. Communities need more help. And we're trying to do that. We have trainings through Cooperative Extension that are designed to help county extension agents and their community partners learn how they can build stronger local food systems. This report is a wealth of information. It was funded through the USDA and has input from many different stakeholders. These are some of the things, the lessons learned, that are included in that report. We need some increased coordination. Food is not on any single table for us to talk about. And so that Department of Food that Mark Winnie talked about is something that we could use. We also need to really encourage more involvement from low-income populations. One of the challenges that we saw as we worked with stakeholders across the state to develop this report was that it is often very difficult to make sure that you have representation, that SNAP beneficiaries are at the table helping to make the decisions about policies that will then influence their access to healthy foods. We also know that communication is key. And there are a lot of different organizations that are already working in the state. The Kentucky Department for Public Health, Kentucky Department of Agriculture, Community Farm Alliance, University of Kentucky, Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service. We have a lot of organizations that are really interested in this issue and would be ready to step up to the table to have this kind of communication with a really broad set of stakeholders, and to use language that is common and that communicates clearly what the facts are and what we might be able to do to find some of that low-hanging fruit. These are a couple of graphics from the Community Farm Alliance report. They would like primarily to see it convened by a non-governmental organization, but to have government involved. Community Farm Alliance has served as a backbone organization for this work in our state. The report states that stakeholders want clear mission, vision, and purpose, focus on economic development, and to advise policymakers. So a Food Policy Council can do a lot of the hard work that helps bring up options for other people to consider and for policymakers to consider. And I'll just close by saying that as I was thinking about this, I thought my take-home point really is that the conversation about food is too important to leave off the table. I come from a long line of food. I'm a native Kentuckian. Grandparents on both sides of our family ran restaurants. And so we really understood, and I have lived all of my life in an environment where feeding people and feeding them well was very important. And I think this is true for many Kentucky families. Kentucky families, and in particular Kentucky children, have been struggling with having access to healthy foods. And so good food policy can solve many of our problems, and that is why we want to bring it before you for consideration. Thanks for your attention.
Any questions for Jan? Could I invite the three of you to join Janet up here and see if there's any more questions from the group as a whole?
Oh, here we are.
You know, really.
We're really grateful for all the trip that you made.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, thank you. Thanks
lot of
for the
food miles.
invitation. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. It's such an honor to be here and to elevate a conversation on the level of food is essential when you start talking about total health, and that's what we're trying to do here in Kentucky. And I know I had the opportunity, and I saw Representative Smart come in, and I saw other representatives that were here, that the CDC had called us in for a legislative meeting to address obesity, and that was so important for us. And our governor signed into executive order something called Kentucky Health Now. And, you know, we've been advancing in the affordable care, but we needed other things to support that total well-being. And in that, we have reducing obesity. So I appreciate your education slides on children, because 1 in 3 of our children are obese, and even more are overweight. And with that, we're addressing foods through coordinated school health. We're also looking at vending machine policies.
Same things that
So,
we're doing.
yes, I really appreciate that. And on the public health side, we're really trying to educate and advance in the area of prevention using the Food Safety Modernization Act. So I don't really have a specific question for you. I just wanted to say I'm so happy to hear any conversation on total health, and whatever we can do in the state, partnering with UK and others, we want to continue to do that in public health, because what we take into our bodies is so essential. It makes us or breaks us. That's the bottom line.
I was just going to say, I really agree, and I'm really glad that you're looking at the whole continuum when you're looking at healthy people. That includes the farm side of it too, where we get our food from and our connections with regional farmers, because that's part of what health means. Yeah.
And actually, you mentioned the Center for Disease Control and their work, and they have been a major partner for us in New Mexico. And for Farm to Table, my organization, we are a part of 3 Center for Disease Control REACH grants right now. We've been contracted with several counties and the Navajo Nation as well to work with them on food systems, looking at it from
great.
the lens of the built environment, food access, and then the policy components that go with that. And we worked in partnership with our Department of Health to actually set the stage for that kind of work collective work in communities in 10 counties and 4 tribal communities over a period of 5 years. So we're, it's all beginning to look like a web, which is great now, and it's
That's what you're
part
trying
of
to
that.
build.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to add that many states and many places often have initiatives like you've described that precede the development of a food policy council. And so, food policy council doesn't necessarily spring out of, thin air. It builds off of those things that already exist. And so you might look for opportunities to, stage the development of food policy council with the idea of integrating some of these other initiatives, or just see how they relate overall.
Particularly in light of our Kentucky Health Now initiative, and I certainly can't speak for the Lieutenant Governor who chairs it, but as a vice chair, it's such a rich oversight team because you have all the cabinet secretaries there at the table.
Wow.
That's
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. We were talking
You
about
have a
it
great
earlier.
opportunity.
Yeah.
Are you the Community Farm Alliance person?
Martin.
Martin is the executive director.
There is, yes. I really thought that was a great report
Yeah.
and a fabulous place to start and starting to build some of these relationships. Really top notch.
You mentioned low-hanging fruit, and we've already, it's amazing low-hanging fruit that you can collaboratively identify
Right.
and take action.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
There's a number of those opportunities.
But I also think, as I mentioned, but it's so important, especially with the Food Policy Council, and even if it's a network or a group, and certainly the Alliance, what you all have done, Martin, has just been incredible to build those relationships, that when you set the stage to start this work, just make sure you're going to be there for a while.
Yes.
Really, and because you don't want to drop the fruit, right? I mean,
Eat
I
it.
mean,
Be
really,
better.
right? Something like that, some metaphor, because that's what we're finding. So now we're really looking at that, as I call it, administrative advocacy. What are the things that are working and not working, and then how can we build on those? And Janet, you brought up the Farm Bill as well. Many of the issues in the Farm Bill have been really significant to us, obviously across the United States. But we've taken the work of our Food Policy Council and looked at what are those priorities, and again embedded our priorities in that discussion in the last 3 Farm Bills, actually, at this point. So it's a great way to create a voice when you might not feel like you have the capacity.
When you mentioned the conflict in Minnesota about sugar beets and being an issue that you had to set aside to agree on other things, can each of you in your work identify some examples of things that have been so conflicting that you just had to set aside to move forward, but you really feel it's an integral component of food policy?
Well, I'll just because of the New Mexico example, and I'm sure Pam can play off of this. I was a nice boy from Connecticut who came to New Mexico and thinking that we didn't have a lot of conflict in Connecticut or with very large scale agriculture, and then encountering it in New Mexico. It took me time to figure out how to adjust. And Pam, being a much better New Mexican than I was, could figure out how to adjust and make these things work. But I do think that it's overall, I think it's better to keep all those people at the table, even when you're not going to agree on everything, and you're going to have to put some issues in a parking lot. Now, saying that, it still gives me pause because I've seen somewhat through my work at Johns Hopkins, being in Baltimore and seeing some of the challenges of the large-scale poultry industry and the Chesapeake Bay area, and related pollution, and then the strength of the poultry industry. People really struggling with trying to figure out how to, maintain a viable industry without also destroying the environment. And there's huge policy challenges there now. We keep bringing up the science, we keep bringing up the data, we keep trying to make the arguments, but it will probably be a case of time and trying to keep that conversation going, keeping people at the table, that will ultimately mean that we end up with what we think will be a better food system, one that's better for the environment, better for people, better for animals, better for farmers. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
I think it's not chasm between big ag or agricultural interests and public health sometimes is hard to negotiate. In San Luis Obispo County, at our last food system assessment, I mean, there's representative from the Farm Bureau, and they really want viable farming to be part of the food system, and we do too. However, what was happening is there was a lot of growth in the wine grape industry, more and more land coming out of other crops and going into wine grapes, and the public health people were saying, that's going to wine. We don't really want that as part of our food system. We just want to cut that out. That we can't even talk about that. And so, there was this, kind of thing, and we tried to really emphasize the importance of everybody staying at the table, despite the fact that there seemed that we needed to have viability for all parties, good food, and we needed viable farm communities. So that there were times when it was a little tricky to have those discussions.
I can actually tell you, in the epicenter of our legislature right now, so a week ago, right about this moment, I was having lunch with our big ag groups in New Mexico, which are dairy producers, cattle producers, and conservation districts, water conservation districts. And they're a part of our New Mexico Food and Agriculture Policy Council. We're an open membership. So Farm Bureau, Farmers Union, and all those groups I just mentioned are at the table with small-scale agriculture groups and agencies that are, health, et cetera. And so they invited me to just have a conversation about now big ag is feeling left out of small ag, which was interesting. And the following day, we were hosting New Mexico Food and Farms Day. And it's our third annual event. We had over 100 organizations. And those organizations were not just farmers and ranchers, but they were the New Mexico Dietetic Association, School Nutrition Association. And we had press conferences and resolutions read on the House and Senate floors, and people introduced, and a lot of conversation. And so then all of those smaller groups will now will participate in AgFest, which has been traditionally large-scale agriculture. And it's a big event at the convention center week after next. So as Gail and Mark said, really sometimes delicate relationships, but the reason why I was in that room last week having a really intense conversation was because of the trust that they have in me as a representative of a lot of groups that have not necessarily been at the table for a long period of time. So that's maybe one that kind of builds on those examples. The other is with our public education department, and now trying to embed the New Mexico grown fresh fruits and vegetables for school meals, because they are the embodying agency to get, to reimburse schools for the federal funding and that kind of thing. They were not that happy about having this program. It wasn't about the agency. It happened to be the deputy director of the state. So it has taken some real relationship building and being at the table at all times, even when the conversations were potentially a little bit uncomfortable. And then learning who are the other partners that maybe could help have that conversation when it might feel uncomfortable between two or three parties. Who else could be having that conversation that could help bridge some of those things. But there's a lot of legalities to it, and we had to help the public education department with all the legal pieces. And they have state funding, and they basically awarded the schools the funding in November, right around the time that all the produce had pretty much sold out. And there was, in part, some intention to that, unfortunately. But now they were at our legislative hearing yesterday and stood up saying that they are fully there to do this program, and that's an exciting turn for us, really exciting turn.
I just want to say one other point, and that is when you're having meetings, there'll be farmers, there'll be public health people, there'll be businesses and so on. And I come from the nutrition and dietetics realm, and one of our meetings we had the Farm Bureau and some farmers, and we had public health people who were more the majority of the meeting. And we were talking about goals, and they were saying, oh, definitely what has to be on the goal is first food. And they meant breastfeeding. And nobody, particularly the farmers, had no
First food?
first
Oh,
food.
first food.
First food. That of life. And the farmers had no clue what they were talking about. And so finally they said breastfeeding. And they were like, what am I doing here? They were really not comfortable sitting here talking about breastfeeding. And so I just realized that our language is, we don't realize the words and the acronyms and so on that we use, and we just need to be very aware of it when we're trying to build these diverse coalitions.
When we started our New Mexico Food and Agriculture Policy Council, the reason why it's food and agriculture, there was a real discussion over that. And our large-scale large-scale ag partners at the table said, well, let's just call it a food policy council, and agriculture means something different. It was the school food service directors and the School Nutrition Association who said, no way. We need the word agriculture embedded in this title. And the reason being is, as school food service directors, we didn't understand what relationship we have to agriculture and that we're feeding agriculture products every day. And they said we want that relationship to be deliberate in our title. And so it is.
Yes.
There's a question over here.
So there's no doubt that this total population representation is imperative to having a successful food council. Can each of you maybe talk a little bit about some of the challenges in bringing those groups to the table, and then how you address and overcome those?
It's great.
Looking down the line.
They're looking down the line.
Okay,
It's
all
not
right, so,
easy.
I mean, I think that some of it will reflect whether it's a local, making this a local effort with the idea of establishing a local food policy council or state level or even sometimes regional. So, I mean, to some extent that will determine who you're going to be reaching out to. I think that in general, you do want to extend the invitation to everybody. I think you want a very transparent process. By everybody, I mean, let's just think of all the typical stakeholders. And that can work relatively well with those who make some kind of living doing this sort of work. But for that community where people aren't constantly engaged in doing food system work, or they're not working at a professional level on this, it often means that you're going to have to be going to them. You're going to have to be reaching out through a lot more sort of labor-intensive kinds of forums. From surveying, working with very neighborhood-based groups, going to their meetings, not expecting them to come to your meetings. I don't know how many times I've said that to a group, and they go, "Yeah, that's a great idea."
Yeah.
Why should we always expect them to come to our meeting? Well, so we have to go out there, and often using different tools in order to bring people together. Now, and I think there has to be some consideration given to different sort of structures in order for governance to be able to work effectively for a food policy council. It can't just be big open forum, whoever happens to show up that day. Los Angeles has a particularly good structure, I think. I don't know what you would say, Gail, but I think that they've embraced. They've included like 700 to 800 different individuals and groups within this fairly elaborate structure that tends to work fairly well. Now they also have, as I understood, 6 full-time staff people, so it's not necessarily a replicable model. But looking at the way they've kind of tiered their work and have provided for good governance is something that's worth taking a look at.
I apologize for interrupting, but I have to go.
Oh!
We're glad that you could join us.
We begin at noon, and I just wanted to come and support all of you all. I'm a graduate of the College of Home Economics at the University of Kentucky.
And your name is?
Representative Pullen. I'm Pullen. And I brought with me someone who has actually paid a lot of money to the College of the School of Human Environmental Sciences. Why is that?
How many kids?
Katie went.
Yeah.
She changed majors, and so I contributed to the cause.
We appreciate your
Nice to have you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Show my support to you all.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Very
Thank
much.
you.
I'm
going to squeeze in here.
Yes, go right ahead.
Thanks so much for coming. Well, I could tell that we could go on all day with our discussion and our questions, because I think this food does bring people together. And that's the power of what we're trying to do, is that everyone cares about food. We want to be respectful of everybody's time and make sure we end on time so that our legislators can also join our speakers for lunch. There's a couple of things I just want to end on, a couple of thoughts as I was listening to everybody's presentation that I'm going to keep in mind as I continue my work in my role. I appreciate, Pam, the 3 Ps, the programs, partners, and policies, and that at the core of those is really health, equity, and which is really very much what Gail said when you talked at the very beginning about the intersection of land, communities, and economies all intersect at health. And so I think that's one of the main parts we need to keep in mind as we approach our work, is that the outcome we're striving for is health, but we are seeing individuals and families as our means to get there. And I don't want to lose the whole notion of the common table. We talk about the table. You talked about the common table, Mark. And I hope that what we've done here today can provide the beginnings of a common table for those of us in Kentucky to talk about food, to talk about increasing food security, talk about food as a means to health, and talk about food and its role in our environment and our economy, and that they're all interrelated, and that the common table must really include all of those. So thank you all for joining us. If you are, if you are a legislator, we hope that you will stay with us and speak with our speakers. All of you, we invite you to complete the evaluation form that was given to you at the beginning. I'm looking for mine. If you would give us some feedback on what we talked about today and how we might continue this work, I would greatly appreciate that. Want to express appreciation to Nelda Moore for her leadership of this process and pulling everybody together. And thank you for coming today. And we at the University of Kentucky look forward to continuing to work with you as we move forward with our work around food. So thank you.
Bill might want us to, if the legislators would sit at the table, we'll have the speakers, and then we'll bring lunch.
At the common table.
At the common table,
Yeah.
and then we'll bring lunch.
So legislators and speakers.
I've got a meeting.
Yes, I'm sorry. I got here late because I've been in meetings, but I'm not going to be able to stay because the House is about to go into session at 12.
You can take lunch if you like.
But
Or
thank
the
you all.
speakers will be here until 4.
Okay.
So if you would like to come back and talk to them personally,
okay.
they will be here. And feel free to take a box lunch if you
Well,
like.
thank
I'm
you
gonna have
all.
to go too. Could I share something with the group?
Yes, please. Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
If you don't mind, I'm gonna bore you for a second about a pet peeve of mine. And we talk about farming and all the things we talk about. I'm a former retailer, so I know a lot about food. And we talk about low-income people, and we talk about food deserts, and we talk about SNAP benefits. I'm an expert on what people buy, and Commissioner Mayfield knows exactly what I'm going to say, because we went to the Winnable Battles conference with the CDC last year or the year before that. I talked to a panel at CDC about childhood obesity. I made a comment in public about me being asked to serve on the Childhood Obesity Task Force. And I'm sorry that Julie Denton had to leave because she appointed me to the task force. And I asked them when they call me, does she want me on the task force because I'm fat? Or does she want me on the task force because I'm a grocer? And so they called me back and said, we want you on there because you're a grocer. I did lose 80 pounds after that. I figured if I was going to be on the Childhood Obesity Task Force, I need to set a good example. But and I've kept it off now for 3 years. But one of the major problems with childhood obesity, food deserts, the bad eating habits of our low-income people is the way we distribute SNAP benefits. We give them that money one time a month. Now, even all of you in the room, somebody give you an amount of money once a month, it's hard to budget that and make it still have money at the end of the month. And what I've been advocating, and again, CDC heard me say this in Atlanta 2 years ago, and they say that the Department of Agriculture is willing to do projects, I guess, pilot projects. Thank you. Appreciate the help. Pilot projects across the country. And I've been after the state of Kentucky, and they keep telling me we're close to being able to do this pilot project. But to distribute those benefits more than once a month. First a month, and I can tell you, I've watched shoppers, okay, people who use SNAP benefits, come in and watch them budget for the month. They can't, milk won't last a whole month, but Mountain Dews will. The only fruit and vegetable they can get that lasts a month is a 10-pound bag of potatoes. So they start out with 4 Mountain Dew, 4 cases of Mountain Dew in the bottom of the cart and 4 bags of potatoes. And they build around that, okay? And that's so, and no matter, you could have the best and the finest farmers market in the country on that 3rd and 4th week of the month, your low-income people can't buy anything from them because they spend all their money. Now, they're not going to have any more money to spend, but if they budget for 2 weeks and then they get another allotment for 2 weeks, toward the end of the month, they can get fruits and vegetables to last a whole month. Because I've seen them shop. I know what they buy. And they're going, 90% of them will spend every penny they have the first week of the month, or those first 10 days of the month when they distribute.
Is that because they do the major shopping like once a month and they go, travel quite a distance, and so they have to do the monthly shopping?
I just think they're afraid that somebody will steal their card, or they can't get a ride back, or multitude. But that's just they have. Yeah. I'm just telling you, I don't know the reasons. I can tell you firsthand because I sold groceries for 40-some years, and it never changed. It's been the same. You buy, and toward the end of the month, I can tell you my sales went, were like this every month. Toward the end of the month, I didn't see any of the SNAP customers unless they were coming back and say, hey, I'm out of milk. Will you let me charge a gallon of milk, which I would not do. I'll give them a gallon of milk. But that's the best way to lose your best customer is charge something to them because they'll never come back.
So. I'm curious, is the state of Kentucky then requesting you a pilot project from SNAP benefits?
Okay, to do this, we're upgrading our system, and they're saying they're getting ready to migrate to this new system that they need to be able to do this. There is additional money required. There is a financial burden because anytime you distribute those SNAP benefits out through the market, there is that financial framework or the credit card framework or EBT network, whatever you want to call it. There is a charge for each transaction back to the state. So if you're going to do it twice, that amount, the charge to the state, there is money involved. Now, one of the ways we've talked about eliminating having a huge, a lot of people just get $30 and $40 and $50. If you don't have a large family and you're not getting over $100 in SNAP benefits, we'll just go ahead and give it to y'all the first of the month. If you're not getting that much, a lot of senior citizens and we're talking about mainly what happens with children. So University of Kentucky, I could sure use your help. I know the commissioner she's a supporter of what we're trying to do, but if more people talk about it, and again, the CDC and the Department of Agriculture agree that that is an issue, and retailers would love it. And I didn't mention retailers, but retailers would hug you if you did it. And I want to make sure that people don't think and I'm a former retailer. I'm not in retail business anymore. But what happens in retail business, you have all this help at the first of the month. You had to have them to deal with this huge volume of, my sales would increase 30 or 40% the first 10 days of the month. And after that, it was a steady decline. I'd go from about $115,000, $20,000 a month down to $70,000 or $80,000 a month. $120,000 a month the first of the month, down to $75,000 or $80,000 at the last week of the month. So it was a steady decline, and I had to have part-time help that I could, I'd use a bunch of them first of the month, and next week a few less. And that last week of the month, I just had a skeleton crew on duty, and so and again, food deserts. You have little grocery stores in the inner city. They can't survive because they do business 10 days a month, and the desert. Now, I do want to say something about people from interesting places, California and Santa Fe. Santa Fe, I'm from Marion County, and the Sisters of Loretto had a real influence on Santa Fe. The Loretto Chapel, St. Francis Boulevard, that's all from my nick from Marion County. That's where they came from originally when they came out to Santa Fe, but they didn't build the steps at the Loretto Chapel. But yeah, that's an amazing story, and it is. But anyway.
And Senator, I completely agree with you. I mean, and I think that this is why food policy councils could really work collectively together on this exact issue, especially around the supplemental nutrition assistance program, because of, just as you said, same thing, whether it's inner city or rural, where we are, that's one of the biggest challenges we have is actually the same thing. On the Navajo Nation, where we're working much more intensely on retail food, what we're working with some of the communities to try and just do their, not just farmers markets, but all flea markets, and that's where they actually have a lot of food and a lot of products, to set those markets up the day that folks receive their SNAP benefits. Again, there's a lot of underpinnings to those things, but as the Senator said, there's some creative ways to actually think this through. And you're suggesting also the challenge is that every time you do it, there's a price tag to doing that.
Yeah, I'd like to see it done once a week,
right.
But that's not going to work. But twice a month, 1st and 15th, and staggered would work. And
do you need to change that though? Does that need to be changed at the federal level to do that, or can it be adapted to the state?
The state would have to apply for a waiver.
Right.
Okay, that's where it starts. State applies for a waiver, and my understanding that the USDA would approve it, and you're off and running. But there is an expense involved, and I think that's one of the big problems that we're just not looking at. And take it from a retailer. I know what they buy. I saw what they did every single month, and those little fat kids running around, and I know they're not getting any milk. They're getting plenty of Mountain Dews, because Mountain Dews will last all month. They're not getting any fruits and vegetables other than they might get a bag of apples and a bag of oranges that last a few days into the month. But toward the end of the month, it's taters and Mountain Dews, and that's their idea of a vegetable, be fried potatoes. They're good. They stick to your ribs.
That's a great policy issue that could actually have some legs to it.
Well, I'm serious, and it's a passion of mine to get that word out. And like I said, it hasn't necessarily fallen on deaf ears in Kentucky. It's just been very slow going. very slow going. So please do. I'd love for you all to do a pilot project, and I can tell Kentucky, look, there.
Or vice versa. Yeah, we'll follow your lead.
Thank you all.
Thanks.